mindfully.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to everyone that is joining this morning, and thank you so much for joining this conversation. My name is Figile Bilagazi from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I work in the discipline of public policy and political science. I would like to start by saying thank you so much to Professor Mahesh Vari Naidu, who is our academic leader for research, for your ongoing support and for also enabling this webinar to be possible. And would also like to extend similarly my gratitude to the cluster that I belong to, the International Public Affairs Cluster, which is called the EPA Cluster. I'd like to thank my colleagues and the student community really in our cluster, and to extend sincere gratitude to the School of Social Sciences as well, to our acting dean, Professor Vivian Ojong, for your ongoing support in the work that we do. In this school. So this morning I am going to talk about a subject that has been at the center of my heart, which is really about, excuse me, I just need to ask for a few seconds. I have my puppy here who's really going wild. So I need to 2 seconds or 2 minutes to sort that out. I'll be back soon. Thank you very much for that. So today then we'll be talking about a subject that is really at the center of my heart, which is a subject that's really been about how do we work in ways and spaces of teaching and learning in ways that promote human engaged pedagogies, something that I call human engaged pedagogies, which our ways of teaching, our ways of learning and in a manner that moves us away from various systems of oppressions of the past, particularly in the sphere of teaching and learning. So that's what I'll be talking about briefly, and of course, I'll be happy to welcome comments, ideas, and suggestions in terms of how also from where you are all sitting are seeing this. So we all know that we're living during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think this is something that has sparked this as well in my heart and in my head. And I would like to then start by recognizing that it is more or less about 8 months since the violent outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic globally. Which is a pandemic that is framed as originating from the villages of Wuhan in China. Many of us have heard that story, and sometime early in February 2020, it became clear to the whole world that this was the message. Although, of course, this remains disputable in that China began at the early days of the outbreak to give signals that the virus may have actually originated from the United States and brought to China, via a group of soldiers that were deployed for a military mission in China. Sometime late in 2019 and early 2020. So a position that the former president, now Donald Trump, vehemently disputed, in the public domain. So there is that dispute around the origin of the pandemic and the virus between the two countries, China in particular and the US. And I start by that because my argument is that that is a dispute that we should not leave unchallenged for purposes of this particular conversation, but in terms of where we find ourselves in the world. In my view, I think that it is a dispute that requires an urgent critical angle of analysis from where we are sitting in our thinking of humanities, in our thinking of scholarship. I think it requires our critical engaging, in particular because of the already observed ongoing economic wars between the two economic superpowers, which are really emerging themselves as the two, it is one of the two of the many, but as the two economic superpowers of the 21st century in the global economy. And my argument is that this is an intellectual responsibility that we have to analyze this ongoing relationship between the US and China. And I would like to imagine that we should be assigned an urgent responsibility to then currently where we are during this pandemic, be critical about the kinds of pedagogical engagements that we undertake within various disciplines that we sit in, of course. I speak from the angle of humanities because that's where I come from, but we could also locate it within social sciences, health sciences, economic sciences, digital sciences, and many other sciences that contribute to the endeavor of being human. So we need to immediately start questioning through our critical scholarship and theoretical traditions. And in my view, then, this is an urgent intellectual commitment that we need to undertake by various stakeholders of the intellectual community. There's many of us. I'm going to take another 2 seconds. I need to sincerely apologize. My dog is really going bizarre. I will be back in 2 seconds to continue the conversation. Sorry about that. Thank you for your patience. We are back. So these are my arguments to say that we then have this intellectual responsibility that I imagine, we should assign to ourselves as intellectuals of the day to urgently engage on various ways in which we could build these human engaged pedagogies in our lifetime. And in my view, it should be a collaboration, and I will show that as we go along. And this is an urgent collaboration that needs to be undertaken by all of us, as various stakeholders, or what I call various stakeholders of the intellectual community, students, teaching workers, learners, and so on, and administrators of the various centers of learning that we occupy. And I would also argue that our parents are also equally uh, key as a stakeholder, communities and activist formations, policymakers, of course, and various government institutions become critical as part of that collective. But returning to what I started with, which is this war between the US, China, trade, China, is just briefly to touch on that, what I mean by that. Just to give context, there is this relationship that has been going on between the US and China pretty much since 1985. Um, at least I would start it there. It may have started way back, which is a relationship of trade. There is a relationship of trade. Um, the U.S. trade deficit with China has actually been soaring high since 1985. To a point that China, the Asian, financial crisis hit in 1997. But what happens is that in 2001, China then joins the World Trade Organization. This is very important to undertake because the World Trade Organization is also undergoing transformation as we speak now during COVID-19. It is going through a process of appointing the Director General. Um, so it's a very, very highly a political process that I think is important for humanities to undertake. But anyway, so in 2001, China's relationship grows. They enter the World Trade Organization. Between 2007 and 2010, we are all hit by another global financial crisis, which of course affects the global markets in a particular way. But what happens is that the relationship between China and the US grows, and they have a relationship of imports and exports. But what happens in 2018, because of the challenges globally that have been happening, is that the trade deficit between China grows. In other words, the relationship of how much they pay each other when they sell goods and services to each other grows, and it becomes such that the United States has got more, it receives more tariffs, more money at the expense of China. And of course, then that starts what we call this trade war. Uh, Briefly, and I'm not going into the depths of it because this presentation is not about that, but I just wanted to highlight that as a matter of context. Which then the role of economists and capitalists like Bill Gates and many other contributors in the economies of the world become key. And I would also not touch on that. However, I think what is important for this presentation is an argument that says that we need to look at the relationship between the COVID-19 outbreak and social inequalities and equity, and how the pandemic continues to deepen challenges that are faced by humanities or humans. Right? This virus is coined as COVID-19, and it is said to be transmittable, of course, largely through droplets between and amongst humans in the form of sneezing, coughing, and touching oneself and each other in certain ways through our hands, personally and collectively, amongst other ways. It is also argued that the use of materials like tissues, cloth, hands, whilst we excrete droplets of different kinds from our bodies, are suspect to enabling the transmission of the virus, which is seen as likely transferable through distance and traveling. As a result, the consequences of the COVID-19 outbreak have been experienced in the last couple of months in multiple forms that, in my argument, then deepen socio-economic and political inequalities in our lives and various forms of inequities that are directed in violent ways. We have seen in South Africa, for instance, right at the outbreak of the pandemic, this high level of punitive militarization of our bodies, where we had the army deployed into communities, and of course the amount of attacks that happened in the hands of the army and livelihoods, increased exposure to global displacements of citizens in various parts of the globe. We've seen in China, for instance, how African bodies were highly displaced and highly violated during right at the beginning of the pandemic. Hunger, starvation, desperation, destitution, and a deep sense of fear and confusion and uncertainty and despair, particularly amongst the elderly of our communities, women, students, various workers, precarious workers, would argue, domestic workers, and mostly essential service workers who have been at the front line since the beginning in the outbreak of this pandemic, like your healthcare workers, food suppliers, transport, energy workers, water providers, and so on, amongst others, who've never really been on a break. So the pandemic has then increased vulnerabilities in the sectors that we would call humanities, sectors that ensure that we become human, amongst, of course, including the economy. And these are bodies of citizens who are really at the center of keeping economies alive as the pandemic unfolds, and most of whom are Black bodies, African bodies, if you look at the globe, bodies of migrants, bodies of asylum seekers, and generally bodies of the working class. And it's important to emphasize that when we talk about teaching in ways that end oppressions, when we are talking about human engaged pedagogies, it is about bodies of people. It is about us as human beings. And we've seen all over television, we've seen in various spaces throughout these 8 months, which bodies get affected, which bodies are on the front line, which bodies are dying. And we have to applaud the Department of Health, the presidency, and we have to recognize the attempts that have been made by various governments in the globe, but particularly also our government in South Africa. In terms of ensuring that the virus doesn't spread, we have to, of course, start by acknowledging the fact that there are attempts that have been made. And whilst we appreciate that, we need to equally remain deeply concerned about the levels of exposure, the risk, and the rates of infections that are experienced by all kinds of frontliners. As we are in level 1 in the pandemic, for instance, we can see in institutions of higher learning how students are even beginning to get infected in residences, exposed to the pandemic. Teaching workers are dying of COVID-19, becoming COVID-19 positive. So it's no longer just an issue of health workers. It is an issue of everyone that is seen to be in the front line of driving this machinery that is our economy in the country and in the world. So we therefore then, I argue that we need to firmly believe that it would be irresponsible of us to continue exposing ourselves in these ways to the viciousness of the COVID-19 pandemic without a sense of imagination that says, how do we teach in ways that regain our sense of humanity in the context of the pandemic? So the argument that I pose and that I present in this webinar is that we need to call an urgent dialogue of some kind as a nation or as a globe that includes, all of us as key voices to frame collectively how we can reorganize ourselves as a body of humanity. How can we reorganize ourselves into safety? How can we reorganize our communities? How do we organize our humanities using, of course, amongst other things, the way that we teach, our content, our pedagogies? And there are various possibilities that lie ahead of us in this regard, including, which is something that I've been arguing since the beginning of the pandemic, deploying and resourcing our homes. Because all of us are home, all of us are locked down. Home has become a center of learning. Home has become a space of education. So home then requires resources that enable education or learning of some kind. And when I speak about home in the context of this presentation, I speak of home as residence, home as shelter, home as space, wherever we are, whatever we call home during this lockdown, needs to be a highly resourced space that enables a form of learning that engages what it means to be human, which means that it needs to have facilities and infrastructure that assists us to carry the work that we are doing, which is the work of teaching, in ways that intertwines the work of taking care of each other, because we are living through a pandemic, we are teaching through a pandemic, which means that it needs to be able to have infrastructure and mechanisms and facilities that assist us as humans who are home, who are in space, who are in shelter, in residence, to carry equally the burden of care collectively with dignity through our families, of course, our neighbors and our loved ones, within communities, or within spaces of shelter and residence in space, in as safely a manner as possible, in our quest to save lives and mitigate the risks of the pandemic. Until we do that, in my view, I don't think that we are ready to return to any form of normality. We can see, even as we are looking down further to lower levels, how citizens continue to be exposed to the pandemic and getting infected continues to unfold. Children in schools, teachers in schools, youth, parents, frontline workers. So we need to think in a more nuanced manner to say, how is it that we can respond to this crisis as a collective, as a globe, particularly for those of us who are located within humanities? My argument is that a pedagogy of humanities has got a responsibility to protect and defend citizens, even from the very content that we teach, even in the manner that we teach. And we should rather use in the next couple of months or the next couple of years that we have to reorganize that content in ways that bring back and engages the human in our pedagogies. So the questions then that I ask is what one of our scholars, Emmanuel Wallerstein, actually asked a couple of years ago, just in 1945, when he imagined what we call a new world system, and he presented a new world system, a world system theory at that time, arguing that the world is shifting towards a particular era, the world is shifting towards a particular paradigm, which is a paradigm in Wallerstein's view, it's a paradigm that was moving the world away from capitalist ways of being. And of course, aligning itself more towards Karl Marx's idea that at some point, the working class will be able to take over. The peasant will be able to take over because capitalism will saturate itself and it will collapse. And that is how the world systems theory is about. But of course, his is sort of looking at different layers. He talks about the fact that the world is organized by the superpowers, which could be the US and your China. And he also talks about the periphery, which is the less developed countries. But he also says that there is an emerging buffer in the middle, which he calls the semi-periphery, countries like South Africa, like ours, economies that are sort of emerging but are not anywhere there, neither are they that poor. So he was looking at some of the economies of the global south, including South Africa, that the world is then going to have to rely on that buffer to be able to change the status quo, so that we are not led just by super rich economies of the world like the United States and amongst others. Anyway, so the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the call that I bring here to us, is that it is pushing us even beyond what Wallerstein was imagining. My argument is that we need to even imagine a new world system theory that is emerging during COVID-19. And I ask this question, could this be then the time to reimagine our humanities? Could this be an emergence of a new world system that we have been waiting for? There are many scholars, many thinkers over time who have been thinking about a decolonized form of doing teaching, a decolonized form of doing our curriculum, our humanities, and in various disciplines and schools of thought. So I ask then, could this be the time? A system that I refer to is the one predicted by Wallerstein, as I've indicated, a possible collapse of the world capitalist order. Other scholars would argue that no, it is not. Wallerstein examines, for instance, the changes in what he calls the hegemonic cycles, cycles of hegemony, cycles of power, perceived as mechanisms that during normal times, what we call normality, those cycles of power would always bring capitalism back to its equilibrium. In other words, it will always be a kind of normality that seeks to maintain the status quo of capitalism, where the rich become richer and the poor become poorer. Right? He argues that he's been doing all of his life, really, he dedicated his time towards this work. He however, argues also that during the coming 3 to 4 decades, and he said this around 2009 or so, equilibrium, which is the capitalist equilibrium, will no longer be attainable globally. Well, what we will instead see, we will see global markets following, capitalist markets in particular. And how he diagnoses this, he looks at various exhaustive possibilities to increase capital accumulation to a point that once capitalist accumulation has accumulated itself, it will therefore also, according to his predictions, collapse. And the only reason why it will collapse, according to Wallerstein, is that capitalism is like any other system in the world, requires someone to exploit. It cannot survive if everybody becomes rich in society. Capitalism is not able to survive itself, because for it, by its very nature, for capitalism to survive, it requires somebody to exploit perpetually. And if it saturates itself and it accumulates itself in ways that there is no body to be exploited anymore, it is bound to collapse. And that is his prediction. I then ask a question in view of that. Could this be a moment of imagining then another world that is possible? When we look at COVID-19 and the pandemic, and you look at how global markets have been functioning, you can see how the economies of the world are struggling. To sustain capitalist modes of production, at least. Could this be an opportunity for us to imagine? I ask these questions because I see that whilst we are grappling with that dire effect, which is the COVID-19 pandemic, the dire effect of the fact that a majority of citizens are losing jobs globally. Majority of workers have become precarious. When you don't have a contract and you can't function and you can't work because of the COVID lockdown, you can't have a salary. Domestic workers have lost incomes because they're probably not needed to do domestic work because many people are now working at home. So are therefore able to do their own domestic work. And there are many other examples that one can make. So whilst we grapple with all of that, we are also rebuilding stronger networks in a sense that many of us have remembered little things that we have forgotten, what it means to have family, what it means to be surrounded by your loved ones, what it means to wake up in the morning and see your neighbor next door to your house. And these are fundamental questions that are embedded at the center of what we call humanities, Ubuntu, how we live our lives in a connected manner as neighbors, as humans, as families, and in our relationships. So we are also then rebuilding stronger networks, family networks, relationships that have been broken over centuries of oppressions within our communities. In that way, we are also rebuilding during this COVID-19 pandemic what it means to be a community, which is really at the center of humanities. Humanities that have been fragmented by various systems of segregation over time. And I list just few: the slave trade, how the slave trade separated families when Africans were taken over the Atlantic Ocean, how global colonialism has done the same when it branded certain people because of their melanin to be better than others, when the borders of our world were created with the main intention of occupying and terrorizing. And apartheid, when some of us, like in South Africa, Israel and Palestine is the same situation, the United States is the same incidence, where racism is really a highly problematic system of oppression. Many of us were segregated on the grounds of our melanin. The darker your skin is, the lesser human you are seen. So COVID-19 is reminding us of all those relationships. And the reason why I argue that we need to go back to human engaged pedagogies is because COVID-19 is taking us back to that. These systems are rooted in heightened religious fundamentalisms, where scripture, where religion, holy texts were used to segregate against certain people, where God was said to be supporting the fact that certain people are better than others. High levels of conservatism, punitive militarization of our bodies through wars and conflict and so on, and communities. Structural adjustments of our livelihoods globally, where our governments have been given money to say, we will fund you for as long as you do not take care of your people. Don't invest in education, do not invest in social services, do not invest in health. Structurally adjusting our livelihoods. So these are the systems that I refer to. On a positive note, however, the argument that I bring around returning back to human engaged scholarship is that I see how this COVID-19 pandemic presents us with opportunities to reorganize ourselves into global communities of care, global communities of love, global communities of sharing, of collective being, of transparency, of generosity, of humility, and being social, which are values that are really deeply embedded in what we call humanities. And these are the values that I call to return back to what we call a human engaged scholarship, human engaged pedagogies. COVID-19 is reminding us at the core of our being of what it means to be social through collective ways of care, love, sharing, generosity, humility, and giving. Many of us have been taking care of each other. There are many things that have been happening. People are hungry. We have been sharing food parcels. We have been sharing everything that we have for ourselves to make sure that the neighbor does not suffer when I have. And the neighbor has done the same to say, I do not need to suffer when the neighbor has. It is a reminder. So it is a moment that has reminded us about what it means to be home, to be family, to be a neighbor, to be a community that takes care of itself and each other in ways that hold together in collective forms of being, as embedded in our philosophical traditions of Ubuntu, what we call Ubuntu in the South. Ujama in East Africa is what is called Butu, as known in other Sotho and Zona-speaking communities. And these are the values that we know in the context of the African philosophical ways of being, which are embedded in various schools of thought that have emerged over time, the African Renaissance, Pan-Africanism, and so on. So without being lengthy, then the call for me that I bring into this call for a human engaged pedagogy or pedagogies is a call really to action and solidarity. And the questions that I'm bringing up are the questions that I'm calling on all of us to reflect through our various intellectual traditions and philosophies in our scholarships, and scholarships of humanities, scholarships of social sciences, health sciences are key, economic sciences are key, digital sciences of our time are key. We are no longer going to return to any normality as we know it. We've entered fully the Industrial Revolution era, which has taken us to online communities. We've become virtual communities. Other scholars, like I think Donna Haraway, speaks about cyborgs. She's a feminist scholar and a feminist thinker. Humanity has become virtual. Many people, when you speak to communities and neighbors and students, anyone that you speak to and ask, how does this moment feel for you? People will tell you it actually feels like science fiction, because we have moved into spaces that are virtual. So digital sciences are also key, amongst others. And these are essential. These are essential intellectual sciences, in my view, that are required to do this work. This work of analysis, it is thinking work, it is intellectual work in ways that assist us to find solutions that can take us into a desired world, which I argue it is a new world that has arrived. We've entered a new era. We are no longer even imagining a new world system. A new world system is here. We need a collaboration within these school of thought to then design for this new world ways of being in community. During the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond, we need to live beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. There is life beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is our new world. It requires a human engaged pedagogical approach. We can no longer afford to be silent in the framing of these emergency responses in our pedagogies that provide a nuanced intellectual response, an intellectual response that is grounded on multiple analyses that are not just biomedical. We have seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, the responses have really merely and mostly been biomedical. We are not just biomedical beings. We are human beings. We are humans. We live in human experiences. So a biomedical approach was useful first and foremost, but not enough. So we need an added layer of analysis and thinking work, which is really centered, amongst other places, within what I call human engaged pedagogies. We need thinking work that emanates from indigenous ways of being, because that's where we are returning to in this new era. We have remembered who we are. Singabantu, Urebatu, we are human. We need thinking work that emanates from a place of being social. What does it mean to be a community? What does it mean to live at home and study? What does it mean to live in residence and study? What does it mean to live in shelter and place and study? So we need all of that. We need the economic elements because we need money to buy bread. We need money to buy food. We need money to buy data. We need money to buy electricity. We need money for solar energy in the rural areas. We still need to be able to eat. And of course, we need the political in our framing because the personal is political. We are organized through political systems. So we cannot fragment our lives in those ways. Our lives have become whole. Humanities and social sciences that include studies and thinking in sociology, like we are doing in anthropology, political economies, gender theories to end the gender wars that we've seen in the past era. The new era that we're entering, my argument, is an era of healing. It's an era of that is egalitarian. It's an era of equality. It's an era of love. So we need critical schools of thought like gender being really and truly embedded in our human engaged scholarships, feminisms, conflict and peace studies, migration, decoloniality, and so on. It's very, very important to return to the study of migrations because it is going to assist us to redesign what it means to live in a globe together and do away with these borders that divide us, do away with these differences that separate us. We've always loved each other. That is the argument of returning back to human engaged scholarship. And that is the idea of decoloniality. I would like to close by cautioning that as we do this thinking work, let us do it in ways that do not put lives in danger, particularly during this pandemic. We have to remember that pandemics have always been violent because they emanate from a place of violence in the first place. So we have to remain mindful that the COVID-19 pandemic is one of those kinds. It is a violent pandemic. It's got an intention to harm. We have to be mindful of that and say that and make that visible, even through our scholarship. To say that this pandemic is vicious, it is pervasive, it is outrageous. So I ask of all of us to be cautious in our decisions, in our considerations, mainly because we already have lost so many lives. As I close, my call is let us return to human engaged scholarship, human engaged pedagogies, pedagogies that are centered on our ways of being a community, on our ways of rebuilding our social fabric that has been eroded by systems of the past that have been oppressive and divisive. And I would like to say our children and our young intellectuals are our future intellectual capital. This is an asset that we need to move us into possible world, the world that we all desire beyond COVID-19. And many of us have been imagining this world. We have always, in various activist cycles, in various scholarly cycles, thinkers and writers have written a lot about another world that is possible. This is the world. We must therefore protect our children and our young intellectuals against all odds from the viciousness and the violences of the COVID-19 pandemic and related systems and imagined world orders. We have to protect each other. We need to love each other that much. We need to heal each other from these oppressions. This is when Ngugi wa Thiong'o would say that we need medicine for our minds. We need medicine for our minds because what coloniality has done, colonization has dismembered us, and COVID-19 is a memory coming back. It is remembering ourselves. It is a moment of healing for our minds. which is here in our brains. We need to know who we are, and we do know who we are. We've discovered who we are. We are returning to our humanity, which means even in the manner that we teach, we must teach in ways that does not fragment the human from a learning experience of what it means to learn. So let us not use at this moment to repeat the mistakes of the past. And this is where even Frantz Fanon would caution us and remind us that this is exactly what happened in 1945, in the early 50s, when independence of Africans happened. The intellectuals of the day and how they responded to the moments of decolonization is something that he is warning us not to repeat. And you can read for yourself in his work when he talks about the pitfall of national consciousness. So let us rather use this moment to reimagine our relationship, for instance, with global financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund, for years, we know, has never wanted to invest in education, has never wanted to invest in the rebuilding of the social fabric of the former colonies. The interest of the International Monetary Fund has always been to use our bodies for profit. The World Bank, similarly, and the World Trade Organization has always served these countries that have always wanted to use bodies of former colonizers for profit. So let us avoid that kind of mistake. Frantz Fanon constantly reminds us about this in our scholarship. To not forget our intellectual responsibility to shape. We have an intellectual responsibility to shape through humanities, human engaged scholarship. Other people would call it activist engaged scholarship. To reorganize, we have a responsibility to reimagine ways of moving ourselves from the violences of the past. This calls on us, as intellectuals of the day, to reimagine a world that is possible without the International Monetary Fund, without the World Bank, amongst others. What we should rather do is to talk about how, for instance, the BRICS Bank, BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the African Development Bank, the African banks, the Latin American banks, the Caribbean banks, the banks of the Pacific Islands, how the people's economy and so on can play that role of rebuilding an economy that is envisaged to rebuild the social fabric of what we call human. A people's economy that will take us into a place that returns to human engaged pedagogies of our time. It is hoped then that as we do this work of imagination, which is really intellectual work, these new financial institutional arrangements and reorganization will express themselves in our lives, which are really driven by the people's economy, and will begin an urgent task of distributing financial resources in ways that seek to rebuild our communities, in ways that seek to rebuild stronger relationships and bonds in our communities, which is really at the center of humanities, communities that will require to usher us into a possible world beyond COVID-19. It is my argument that if we do this, we will really and truly emerge out of the COVID-19 crisis with stronger communities, revitalized social bonds and social institutions, collective networks, and stronger social fabric that will hold us intact for many generations to come. We really owe this to ourselves and our children and our young intellectuals of the world beyond COVID-19. It is my intellectual reading, colleagues, that we have an opportunity to take ourselves into that possible world under this decisive leadership internationally of Comrade Tedros Adhanom at the World Health Organization. There's many things that have happened during this moment in the World Health Organization. But it is my reading that Tedros Adhanom, the leader of the World Health Organization, is providing us with a kind of leadership that we need in our lifetime, in a moment as COVID-19, but also in this era of this new world system that we've entered. So I would appeal that we support his leadership. He's the only man that has stood up against the US and Donald Trump and said, you are no longer going to perpetuate this narrative of racism globally. And you remain unchallenged. And for that, we have to support him. That's very key for a human engaged pedagogue. I also call then on other international institutions like the United Nations Human Rights Council, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. UNESCO is very key in this journey of returning back to human engaged pedagogies. UNESCO determines scientific, educational, and cultural issues of the globe. UNESCO influences decisions of how we teach in our own countries. It's important that UNESCO, amongst other institutions and the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, join hands with Tedros Adhanom in terms of how this work of reorganization can be done collectively to take us into a world that is possible post-COVID-19. And this collective engagement between these institutions is urgent. It's very essential during this pandemic and must happen immediately, in my view, to begin a process of reimagination, intellectual work, and reorganizing the world into a place of possibilities beyond this COVID-19 pandemic. The withdrawal of the financial resources of the United States from funding the World Health Organization, in my view, is a decision that we need to welcome globally. It's a power shift. It's a power shift. It's a return to human engaged ways of being. It is moving us away from capitalist engaged ways of being. Power is reorganizing itself into our favor. We need to use this moment to reorganize these international institutions in ways that build on a global people's economy that is created and grounded on values and principles of collective sharing that are centered in a place of deep love, deep care, and an intention to build rather than to fragment international communities in ways that the International Monetary Fund has done over time since 1945 and the World Bank. So if we do this, it is my argument in this new world system that returns us to human engaged pedagogies. If we do this, I also request that we reimagine the manner in which global financial institutions can be reorganized. We probably can still keep the IMF and the World Bank, but they require reorganization, and the World Trade Organization included. They need to be reorganized in ways that are not driven from a place that sustains greedy, white monopoly, patriarchal capital. It is my request that we reimagine the manner in which global financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and others can be reorganized in ways that do not drive from a place that sustains greedy, white monopoly patriarchal capital, who have always found stimulation from ways of working that use and abuse bodies of our people on the ground for labor, most of whom I've indicated are global South African Black women, working class citizens. So we have an opportunity to stop this manner of violence now and for all. COVID has shown us we have that power, and that power is expressed in our beautiful rage all over the globe. This beautiful, calming, decisive rage Also, that was demonstrated by Tedros Adhanom when he was actually facing Donald Trump in the eye, as he demonstrated, of course, when he confronted him on the question of race, amongst other things. This is a kind of power and a base from which we can all organize ourselves from. This is how we are going to fight the spread and the arrest of the COVID-19 pandemic and its related global economic and social consequences, which in my view are oppressions of the past. Depending on, of course, on how we respond, all of us, it is then a call to urgent solidarity. This is a call to intellectual solidarity between international institutions to begin to imagine emergency responses during this global crisis in ways that can usher us into an era that we have already landed in, an era that does not rely on the current organization of the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, because that is a mistake. We need the ways of working of these global financial institutions that will organize urgently in ways that are grounded on the values and principles of collective building and not fragmenting countries. This means investing in localized. The IMF has got to invest in localized collectives of people's economies on the ground. The World Bank, if it invests in anything, it has to invest in ways that enable a collective sharing and distribution of capital on the ground. It also means that the World Trade Organization is investing in the rebuilding of our health systems, education systems, social security systems, knowledge systems, economic systems of the world, social systems, social bonds of communities and countries, social networks that work together towards that vision. The reading, colleagues, is that we are ready as a globe, as a people of the globe. We are ready to support this vision on the ground. More so, the COVID-19 pandemic has taken us into that place. We've been taking care of each other. So if you continue in this way, it may be that this is the last pandemic, the last of these kinds of pandemics. We've seen so many of them. We've seen SARS, we've seen Ebola, we've seen so many of them. It may be that if we hold our hands in the manner that we do, and we do not return to the capitalist equilibrium, that we will be seeing this pandemic that we call COVID-19 as the last of its kind for a very, very long time in the next couple of centuries to come. This is one thing that I agree upon with our number one richest man on earth, Bill Gates' predictions. Depending on how we respond, of course, during this crisis, we may never see a pandemic of this nature again, at least for the next millennium to come. My argument and my reading, colleagues, is that this is possible. I therefore call on all of us in the various learning centers, all of us, the leadership of our education systems, of our learning systems, to rethink the way in which we are deciding during these moments, and to invest highly in a return towards human-engaged scholarship, human-engaged pedagogies that rebuild our homes, that rebuild our communities, that build people's economies, that put food in the stomach of our people, that put money in the hands of the people. I would like to say I belong to the University of KwaZulu-Natal, an institution like ours that is really committed to building African scholarship, a scholarship that is driven from a place of intellectual excellence and greatness. The University of KwaZulu-Natal already has an amazing mechanism that we call the portfolio of community engagement, which we have been utilizing and can strengthen to place our teaching and learning in community during COVID-19, but also beyond, in ways that returns us deeply into human engaged pedagogies. And in that way, we'll be truly decolonizing the curriculum. We have an institutional mechanism in place for this to happen through a well-developed portfolio of community engagement in our administration and praxis. We have well-developed assessment systems that are already in place and are linked to our performance monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. We are therefore very ready as an institution to embark on this intellectual journey of teaching and learning in ways that return us to human engaged pedagogies. I would like to call, of course, collaborations with various institutions. We will then need to reimagine how we reorganize in ways that enable, of course, the intellectual community, students, teaching workers, and administrators to then have access to infrastructure, social infrastructure, in this particular case, food, electricity, shelter, place, whilst learning and teaching in community. We are a community. There are many other mechanisms that are in place, which I will not talk about at the interest of time. We've got the NSFAS, we've got the resources within the taxpayer income. We will need to redirect that resource in ways that enable students and teachers and parents, neighbors, all of us who are part of the intellectual community to access these resources for purposes of learning and community and rebuilding a human engaged scholarship. And we can also explore various ways in which this reorganization can be facilitated by partnering with local institutions within communities that enable these services to be distributed in ways that return us to human engaged pedagogies. So at the center of this call is the human. At the center of this call is the human. That we are human, singabantu, umuntu ngomuntu ngabantu. Let us teach and learn in ways that remember that we are human and rebuild the human infrastructure. When we do that, we'll also be rearranging and strengthening bonds in relationships at the center of the African Renaissance theory, at the center of Pan-Africanist theories, at the center of all kinds of school of thoughts that talk about Ubuntu. It is relationships, it is bonds, it is neighborhoods, it is community networks that were long eroded by centuries of organized slavery, capitalism, white monopoly capital, imperialism, colonization, and apartheid. So we will also, in so doing, be contributing into the reorganization of values and principles that are embedded in care, love, dedication, support, holding together as a society, as we see and imagine through our critical decolonizing philosophies and scholarships. We will also be holding ourselves accountable to our commitments of an intellectual machinery that aspires for a transformative curriculum that is foregrounded in decoloniality of thought and praxis. We are decolonizing when we return to a human engaged pedagogy or pedagogies. We are mindfully decolonizing our curriculum. We are transforming ourselves. We are reorganizing our ways of working. And this is an opportunity. We are creators of knowledge. When we do that, we'll also be creating knowledge. Students and learners will also be learning through engaged social pedagogies that deploy needed intellectual capital in communities as part of doing what we call activist scholarship, as part of doing what we call community engaged scholarship, as part of doing what we call human engaged scholarship, social engaged scholarship. And our students are ready. They've demonstrated this with the hashtag Fees Must Fall since 2015. So my proposal is a very long story, but I would love to leave it at this and say I then call on us really to intellectual action that moves us into that direction in the next couple of months as we emerge out of COVID-19. Let us return to human engaged scholarship. This is time for a move to a decolonized praxis that transforms our societies into places and centers of learning and teaching, as was known and experienced by our ancestors and ancestresses, and the spirits that have gone before us yet live amongst us in our bodies and in our psyche. Voices of reason inside of me tell me and remind them of some of these mistakes that of the past that we have made. When a moment like this presented itself post World War II in 1945 and beyond, most of our African countries began a shift towards decolonization and freedom from imperial powers, a shift that was necessary to take place at that time. The voices of my spirit and ancestral guides and reasons of our forefathers and foremothers and foreparents whisper daily to my intellectual reasoning that some of these mistakes can be remedied. So we need to act with vigilance, determination, and a deep sense of purpose as we undertake this journey. This is the time. Sadly, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have failed to take us into this new world post 1945. Mine is an imagination of a new world system that is able, without the IMF and the World Bank, to take us back into collective ways of being in community. We can explore these ways through continued and sustained intellectual debate and thinking work, through our research in community as we teach, learn from within how we can collectively reorganize our episteme from our varied standpoints and schools of thoughts that are allowed to emerge, of course, from our imagination of our local experiences of place, shelter, and time that is powered by the people. We are the people. This is our power. This is our center to hold and to return to human engaged pedagogies. My view is that these kinds of investments that we will need to make to take this action forward in the immediate and in the long term are located in the work of collaboration of scholarship, in the work of collaboration of action research that responds to immediate needs of communities. So an urgent collaboration between various sciences would be required urgently, as I've indicated. And these sciences could vary, but they need to center themselves around issues of food security, electricity and energy supply, water and sanitation, shelter and place in communities, communications and information systems, political science and intellectual and international relations, critical epistemes of gender, feminisms and constructivisms, anthropological teaching and learning, sociological teaching and learning, rural and townships development, local and township developments, digital sciences of our time, transport sciences, heritage, tourism, teaching and learning, geography and environment, indigenous knowledge systems, amongst others. This will also lessen the burden of our current reliance, heavy reliance upon violent epistemes of the past that is largely drawn from arrangements of global capitalism, slavery, colonization, imperialism, and apartheid. We would be creating knowledge when we do that. We will rely less on the epistemes of violence. We will then emerge and we will achieve our commitment to a transformed and decolonized education system of our lifetime. And this is how I see it from where I'm sitting, colleagues. I would like to really call on us to rise into this call with humility and solidarity and holding hands and return to the human in our pedagogies, to return to engaging the social in our pedagogies. Remember that singabantu, umuntu ngabantu. We have always loved each other. And this era that we are in is an era of healing, is an era of love. Let us teach in ways that promote loving of the community, loving of one another, holding of each other, and not fragmenting through ways of promoting inequalities and inequities in the manner that we teach and learn. Thank you so much for listening. I realized that I've spoken so much. It was really coming from a place of a deep place in my heart, which is why I was, conducting this webinar. So I will open for questions and comments or thoughts. I know that we had scheduled this until 11:30, and I've taken most of the time in terms of my presentation. The floor is open. Thank you. I don't see any hands so far. Just want to say thank you so much to everyone that has watched through YouTube and on Facebook and here in the Zoom room. I will read some of the messages that are in the chat room in the meantime. One of the participants here says, morning, Dr. Vilakazi, you are raising very important questions about the kind of world that we need to build, a human world. I have to go, Doc, but I have an honest seminar, but take care. Thank you so much for raising these issues. Dr. Kereng is also saying, thank you so much, Dr. Vilakazi, for your presentation. It is obvious we have to change and rebuild our social cohesion. Decolonizing our mind is the way to go. Says Iyo, Doctor, we are already indebted to these international financial institutions. I know very much, Dr. Kereng. How do we reverse it? Is it possible? We will support him, Gogo. I suppose he is mentioning Tedros Adhanom, the honorable leader of the World Health Organization. And she also says the United States withdrawal from funding the World Health Organization, I really agree, was a blessing in disguise. Leaders can now think without the influence of the United States as power. Yes, for Mandla, that is actually what we need in the world. And someone also says, Ustelo, thank you so much, Dr. Vilakazi, for such an informative presentation. So I would also like to say thank you to everyone. I'm going to check quickly if there's any comments on YouTube and on Facebook. Otherwise, if there are no further comments, we will then close on that note. Yeah, I see that other people have liked the presentation from Facebook and from YouTube. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening. We have to return to human engaged pedagogies. I would like to thank the University of KwaZulu-Natal for giving me an opportunity to do this webinar, Professor Maheshwari Naidu from who's our academic leader for research, the School of Social Sciences, where I belong, Professor Ojong. Thank you so much. She's our acting dean in the School of Social Sciences. I also do want to say that the views that I express here are not the views of the university. They are the views that I uphold individually as a scholar within the university. So they should not be read and understood to be representing the views of the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day, everybody. Till we meet again.